The thunder of hooves on hard, packed earth broke the dawn's silence as Grace Blackburn's wagon careened toward the canyon edge. Her panicked screams lost in the wind, while the runaway horses charged forward with no sign of stopping. Moments from disaster, a blur of motion appeared alongside a cowboy on a chestnut stallion who, with a seemingly impossible leap, landed on the wagon bench beside her, his weathered hands snatching the reins and pulling with all his might. Arizona Territory, 1876. The wheels of the wagon scraped perilously close to the edge of the cliff, sending small rocks tumbling down into the canyon below. Grace clung to the seat, her knuckles white as she watched the stranger fight to control her panicked team of horses. The wagon tilted dangerously, one wheel momentarily lifting off the ground before slamming back down with a jarring thud. "Hold on, madam," the cowboy shouted, muscles straining as he pulled back on the reins with everything he had. The horses whinnied and fought against the sudden restraint, but the man's strength proved greater. The wagon slowed, the horses gradually responding to his commanding presence. With expert precision, he guided the team away from the cliff edge, bringing them to a halt several yards from certain death. The silence that followed was broken only by the heaving breaths of the horses and the quiet creaking of the wagon settling. Grace's heart pounded so loudly in her chest she was certain the stranger could hear it. She turned to face her rescuer, taking in his sun-bronzed face, piercing blue eyes, and the trail dust covering his clothes. "Thank you," she managed, her voice trembling as she smoothed her skirts with shaking hands. I don't know what happened. The horses just bolted." The cowboy released the reins and removed his hat, revealing dark hair damp with sweat. "Preston Gray," he said, offering a calloused hand. "Folks call me Prees." "Grace Blackburn," she replied, accepting his handshake. His touch was firm but gentle, and she found herself reluctant to let go. "I'm forever in your debt, Mr. Gray." "No debt necessary, Miss Blackburn. Anyone would have done the same." His eyes scanned the surroundings. "What brings a lady like yourself out here alone? These parts can be dangerous." Grace straightened her spine. "I'm headed to Tucson. My uncle died recently and left me his general store. I'm to take it over." Preston raised an eyebrow. "Tucson's still a half-day's ride from here, and this trail isn't the safest, especially for someone traveling alone." "I had little choice in the matter," Grace replied, lifting her chin. "And I'm perfectly capable of handling myself, or I was until—" She gestured toward the cliff edge, a flush creeping up her neck. Preston's lips quirked into a half-smile. "No shame in a bit of bad luck, Miss Blackburn. Happens to the best of us." He glanced at her wagon and frowned. "Seems one of your traces is frayed, might be what spooked your team." Grace followed his gaze, noticing the worn leather strap he indicated. "Can it be fixed? I can mend it well enough to get you to Tucson," Preston offered, already moving to inspect the damage more closely. "I was headed that way myself." Grace watched as he retrieved tools from his saddlebags and began working on the harness. His movements were efficient and practiced, his strong hands making quick work of the repair. "You're quite handy, Mr. Gray," she observed. "Comes with the territory," he replied without looking up. "A man who can't fix his own gear doesn't last long out here." As Preston worked, Grace took the opportunity to study him more carefully. He wasn't like the dandies back in Boston with their soft hands and perfumed collars. Everything about him spoke of hard work and resilience, from his sun-weathered skin to the lean, muscular build evident beneath his simple clothes. "There," Preston announced, standing and brushing dust from his hands. "That should hold until we reach town. I'll ride alongside if you don't mind the company." "I'd welcome it," Grace admitted, surprising herself with her candor. "It seems I have much to learn about this territory." Preston nodded, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Arizona's unforgiving to those who don't respect her ways, but she rewards those who take the time to understand her." He helped Grace back onto the wagon seat before mounting his own horse. "Stay to the center of the trail," he advised, "and keep a steady pace. I'll be right beside you." As they set off toward Tucson, Grace found herself stealing glances at her unexpected companion. There was something about Preston Gray that intrigued her, a quiet confidence that didn't demand attention, but commanded respect nonetheless. "Have you lived in Arizona long, Mr. Gray?" she asked, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Born and raised, he replied. My father ran cattle near Prescott before Apache raids forced us south. Been working ranches around Tucson these past 8 years. And your family, a shadow crossed Preston's face. Lost Pa to fever 3 winters back. Ma returned east to live with my sister in St. Louis. I'm sorry for your loss, Grace said softly. Preston merely nodded, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. Life out here takes as much as it gives. After a moment, he turned the conversation. What about you, Miss Blackburn? What brings a proper Boston lady to the Arizona territory? Grace raised an eyebrow. How did you know I'm from Boston? A smile tugged at Preston's lips. Your accent, and those shoes aren't made for western dust. Grace glanced down at her once fine leather boots, now coated with a layer of reddish soil. I suppose I'll need to invest in more suitable attire. Tucson has a decent mercantile. You can outfit yourself proper there. My uncle's store, you mean, Grace said, a note of uncertainty creeping into her voice. Though I confess I know little about running such an establishment. Blackburn's General Store. Preston looked surprised. You're Ezra Blackburn's niece. You knew my uncle. Everyone in Tucson knew Ezra. Good man, fair in his dealings. Preston's expression softened. He spoke of family back east, but I never expected. He trailed off, studying her with newfound interest. What? Grace asked, self-conscious under his scrutiny. Nothing, Preston replied, looking away. Just that Ezra was well respected. You've got big boots to fill. Grace gripped the reins tighter. I'm aware of that, Mr. Gray, and I intend to do just that. They continued on, the landscape gradually changing as they approached Tucson. The sparse scrub gave way to more frequent cacti and the occasional patch of greenery near hidden water sources. The sun climbed higher, beating down mercilessly, and Grace was grateful for the wide brim of her bonnet. May I ask what brings you to Tucson today? She ventured as they passed a small homestead with chickens scratching in the yard. Supply run, Preston answered. And checking mail. The ranch I work for, the Double Bar, is about 15 miles northwest of town. Do you enjoy ranch work? Preston considered the question before answering. It's honest work. I'm good with horses and the boss is fair. He glanced at her. Not many choices for a man without land or money of his own. Do you hope to have your own ranch someday? Something flickered in Preston's eyes, a dream quickly shuddered. Every cowhand talks about it. Few manage it. But you're not like every cowhand, are you, Mr. Gray? Grace said quietly, surprising herself with her boldness. Preston looked at her sharply, as if trying to determine whether she was mocking him. Whatever he saw in her expression must have satisfied him, for his features relaxed into a genuine smile that transformed his face. No, madam, I reckon I'm not, he conceded. As they crested a rise, the sprawling settlement of Tucson came into view below them. Adobe buildings glowed golden in the afternoon sun, the church steeple rising above the surrounding structures. Smoke curled from chimneys, and the distant sounds of life, horses, wagons, voices drifted up to meet them. There she is, Preston said. Not San Francisco, but she's growing every year. Grace surveyed what was to be her new home with a mixture of apprehension and determination. It was so different from Boston's crowded streets and brick buildings, both more primitive and somehow more alive under the vast Arizona sky. It's not what I expected, she admitted. Give it time, Preston advised. Tucson has a way of growing on you. They made their way down into the town, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Grace was acutely aware of how out of place she must appear in her Eastern clothing, perched high on the wagon seat beside her rugged companion. Preston guided her through the dusty streets until they reached a 2-story building with Blackburn's General Store painted in fading letters across its wooden facade. A smaller sign below announced, Post Office. Here we are, Preston said, reining his horse to a stop. Your uncle's place, your place now. Grace stared at the building, reality suddenly crashing down upon her. This weathered structure represented her future, her livelihood, her new beginning. The enormity of what she had undertaken threatened to overwhelm her. It's larger than I imagined, she managed. Preston dismounted and came around to help her down from the wagon. His hands at her waist were steady as she descended, and she found herself grateful for his solid presence. Stores on the main floor, he explained, stepping back once she was safely on the ground. Living quarters upstairs. Ezra kept a small stable out back for his deliveries. A thin, gray-haired man emerged from the store, adjusting spectacles perched on his nose. Miss Blackburn. He called, hurrying forward. We weren't expecting you until tomorrow, Mr. Wilson. Grace recognized the name from the correspondence following her uncle's death. Yes, madam, Thomas Wilson. I've been managing things since your uncle's passing. His eyes darted to Preston Gray. Good to see you. Jenkins was asking after that order for the double bar. Preston nodded. I'll see to it, Tom. Just wanted to make sure Miss Blackburn arrived safely. Mr. Wilson looked between them with evident curiosity. You two are acquainted. Mr. Gray was kind enough to assist me when my horses were spooked, Grace explained, omitting the more harrowing details of their meeting. He escorted me the rest of the way. Well, providential indeed, Wilson exclaimed. Come inside, Miss Blackburn. You must be exhausted from your journey. Grace turned to Preston, suddenly reluctant to part ways with the man who had saved her life. Thank you again, Mr. Gray. I don't know how I can repay you. Preston replaced his hat, touching the brim in a gesture of respect. No payment necessary, Miss Blackburn. Perhaps I'll stop by in a few days to see how you're settling in. I'd like that, Grace replied, her voice softer than she intended. Something passed between them, a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Then Preston nodded, mounted his horse, and with a final tip of his hat, rode toward the livery at the end of the street. Grace watched him go, an inexplicable sense of loss tugging at her heart. Then, squaring her shoulders, she turned to follow Mr. Wilson into what was now her store, her home, her life. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity as Grace familiarized herself with the operation of the general store. Under Mr. Wilson's patient guidance, she learned the inventory system, pricing structure, and credit arrangements with regular customers. She discovered that her uncle had been not only a merchant but also the town's postmaster, a responsibility that now fell to her as well. The store itself was larger and better stocked than she had anticipated, carrying everything from foodstuffs and fabric to tools and ammunition. A small selection of books and periodicals occupied one corner, while medicines and tonics lined shelves behind the main counter. Your uncle believed in providing for all of Tuckson's needs, Mr. Wilson explained as he showed her the ledgers. He extended credit when necessary, but was firm about repayment. The townspeople respected him for his fairness. Grace nodded, determined to uphold her uncle's reputation. And the post office duties. Mail comes by stage twice weekly. Most folks collect their own, but some outlying ranches and mines have arrangements for delivery. Wilson adjusted his spectacles. It's a responsibility, but it keeps customers coming through the door. By the end of her third day, Grace's head was spinning with information, and her feet ached from standing. She had met dozens of Tucson residents, from the mayor's wife to ranch hands to the Chinese laundry owner. Some had greeted her with warm welcome, others with barely concealed skepticism about a young Eastern woman running Tucson's main mercantile. That evening, after closing the store, Grace climbed the narrow staircase to the living quarters. Her her apartment consisted of a small parlor, bedroom, kitchen, and a luxury she hadn't expected: a proper bathroom with a copper tub. The furnishings were simple but sturdy, with touches that spoke of Ezra Blackburn's long residence. Books on shelves, a comfortable reading chair, a writing desk positioned to catch the morning light. Grace sank into the chair, exhaustion washing over her. She had left Boston seeking independence after her parents' deaths, determined to make her own way rather than accept the marriage proposal of a man she respected but did not love. Her uncle's bequest had seemed providential, a chance to start fresh, to prove her capabilities in a place where no one knew her or had preconceived notions of what she should be. Now, alone in the gathering dusk, doubts crept in. Could she truly manage this business? Would the people of Tucson ever accept her? And why, amidst all these pressing concerns, did her thoughts keep returning to a blue-eyed cowboy who had appeared just when she needed him most? A knock at the store's front door startled her from her reverie. Frowning, Grace lit a lamp and descended the stairs. Through the window, she could make out a familiar silhouette, broad shoulders, cowboy hat, the glint of something metallic in his hands. Her heart quickened as she unlocked the door. Mr. Gray. Preston stood on the boardwalk, hat in hand, looking somewhat uncomfortable. He held a covered dish. "Miss Blackburn, I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Grace replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please come in." Preston hesitated before crossing the threshold. "I can't stay long, just wanted to check how you're settling in." He held out the dish. "And Mrs. Martinez at the cafe asked me to bring this by, said a lady new to town might appreciate a home-cooked meal." Grace accepted the dish, lifting the cloth to discover a fragrant stew. The thoughtful gesture brought a lump to her throat. "That's very kind. Please thank Mrs. Martinez for me. You can thank her yourself next time you visit the cafe." Preston glanced around the store, seemingly reluctant to meet her eyes. "Tom says you're picking things up quick." "Mr. Wilson has been patient," Grace replied, "though I have much to learn." An awkward silence fell between them. Preston shifted his weight and Grace noticed he was freshly shaved, his clothes cleaner than when they'd first met. "Was there something else, Mr. Gray?" she prompted gently. Preston cleared his throat. "There's a social at the church this Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just music, dancing, refreshments. Thought you might want to know, being new to town and all." Grace couldn't help but smile. "Are you inviting me, Mr. Gray?" A flush crept up Preston's neck. "Just passing along information, madam. Thought it might be a good way for you to meet more folks." He put his hat back on, seemingly eager to retreat. "I should let you get to your supper before it goes cold, Mr. Gray," Grace said as he turned to leave. "Would you care to join me?" "There's plenty here for two, and I'd welcome the company." Preston hesitated, surprise evident in his expression. "That wouldn't be proper, Miss Blackburn. A single lady dining alone with a man folks would talk." Grace raised an eyebrow. "I'm a business owner now, Mr. Gray. I imagine people will talk regardless of what I do." She set the dish on the counter. "Besides, I owe you my life. Surely a meal is the least I can offer." A smile tugged at Preston's lips. "When you put it that way, madam, I'd be honored." Grace led him upstairs to the apartment, acutely aware of propriety but unwilling to dine alone again. She set the small table in the kitchen while Preston stood awkwardly by the door. "Please sit," she invited, bringing plates and utensils. "Tell me about this ranch where you work." As they shared Mrs. Martinez's excellent stew and fresh bread, Preston gradually relaxed, describing the double bars operations and his role as head wrangler. Grace found herself captivated by his knowledge of horses and cattle, the way his face animated when speaking of work he clearly loved. "The boss, Jenkins, he's getting on in years," Preston explained. "Been talking about selling up, moving to California where his daughter settled. Most of the hands worry about who might buy the place." "You care about the ranch," Grace observed. Preston nodded. "Been there 5 years. Longest I've stayed anywhere since Pa died." He studied her across the table. "What about you, Miss Blackburn? Boston must be quite different from all this." Grace considered her response. Boston was stifling in its way. So many expectations, so many rules about what a lady should and shouldn't do. She met his gaze directly. "After my parents died last year, there seemed little reason to stay. No other family, a distant cousin who made it clear I was a burden. And a gentleman who offered marriage as a solution to my circumstances." Grace's tone grew wry. "He seemed surprised when I declined." "His loss," Preston said quietly. The simple statement, delivered without artifice, warmed Grace more than she cared to admit. They continued their meal, conversation flowing more easily as they discovered shared interests in books and a mutual appreciation for straightforward speech. As the evening drew to a close, Preston helped clear the table before retrieving his hat. "Thank you for the meal and company, Miss Blackburn." "Grace," she said impulsively. "My friends call me Grace." A slow smile spread across Preston's face. "Then I hope you'll call me Prees." He paused at the top of the stairs, turning back to face her. "About that social on Saturday, if you'd like an escort, I'd be happy to accompany you. Strictly as a friendly gesture for a newcomer, of course." Grace felt a flutter of anticipation. "I'd like that very much, Prees. I'll call for you at 7 then." With a tip of his hat, he descended the stairs and was gone. leaving Grace with a curious lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with the meal they'd shared. Saturday arrived with unexpected speed, the intervening days filled with learning the store operations and meeting more Tucson residents. Grace found herself watching the clock as evening approached, her anticipation growing. She had spent more time than she cared to admit selecting a dress from her limited wardrobe, settling finally on a sky blue gown with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, more modest than Boston fashion but still elegant. At precisely 7 o'clock, a knock sounded at the store entrance. Grace descended the stairs, smoothing her skirts nervously, and opened the door to find Preston waiting. He had clearly made an effort with his appearance. His dark hair was neatly combed, his shirt crisp, and he wore a vest and string tie that gave him a distinguished air without sacrificing the rugged quality she found so appealing. "Miss Blackburn," he greeted her, eyes widening slightly as he took in her appearance. "You look lovely." "Thank you," Grace replied, pleased by his reaction. "And please remember it's Grace." Preston offered his arm. "Shall we?" The church was only a short walk down the main street, and Grace was grateful for Preston's steady presence as they entered the social gathering. Lanterns illuminated the churchyard, where tables had been arranged with refreshments. A small group of musicians played lively tunes, and several couples were already dancing in a cleared area. "Miss Blackburn," Thomas Wilson approached, his wife at his side. "So pleased you could join us, and with Preston as your escort, no less." Grace felt Preston stiffen slightly beside her but smiled warmly at the Wilsons. "Mr. Gray was kind enough to invite me. I'm eager to meet more of the community." "Indeed, indeed." Mrs. Wilson eyed them with undisguised interest. "Everyone's been curious about Ezra's niece from back east." "Such a fine gentleman he was. I've heard nothing but good things about my uncle," Grace replied. "I hope to honor his legacy." "You've made a fine start," Wilson assured her. "The way you handled that pricing dispute with Jorgensen yesterday, Ezra himself couldn't have done better." Preston looked at her with raised eyebrows. "Pricing dispute," Grace shrugged modestly. "Mr. Jorgensen felt the price of nails had increased unfairly. We reached an understanding." "She stood her ground without giving offense," Wilson explained to Preston. "A rare talent." The conversation was interrupted as more townspeople approached, eager to meet the new proprietor of Blackburn's general store. Grace was introduced to so many people that the names began to blur, but she did her best to remember faces and connections, aware that these were not just potential customers but neighbors and perhaps future friends. Throughout it all, Preston remained at her side, occasionally providing quiet explanations or context when needed. His steady presence gave her confidence, and she found herself genuinely enjoying the evening. When the musicians struck up a waltz, Preston turned to her. "Would you care to dance, Grace?" The way he said her name sent a pleasant shiver through her. "I'd be delighted." Preston led her to the dance area, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while taking her other hand in his. As they began to move to the music, Grace discovered that despite his rugged occupation, Preston was a surprisingly graceful dancer. "You dance well," she remarked as he guided her through a turn. "My mother insisted all her children learn proper manners," he replied with a hint of amusement. "Said just because we lived on the frontier didn't mean we had to behave like savages." "A wise woman," Grace observed. "I'd like to meet her someday." Something flickered in Preston's eyes, surprise perhaps, at the implication of future acquaintance. "She'd like you," he said after a moment. Strong women respect other strong women. As they continued dancing, Grace became aware of curious glances from the other attendees. "People are watching us," she murmured. "You're the most beautiful woman here," Preston replied simply. "And the newest arrival, of course they're looking." The compliment, delivered without artifice, brought warmth to Grace's cheeks. "I think they're more interested in seeing me with you." Preston's steps faltered slightly. "Meaning?" Mr. Wilson mentioned that you don't typically attend these gatherings, and Mrs. Jenkins seemed quite surprised to see you dancing. A rueful smile crossed Preston's face. "I'm not much for socializing, it's true. Prefer the company of horses most days. They don't expect conversation." "Yet here you are," Grace observed. Preston's eyes met hers, his gaze direct and unguarded. Here I am." The simple statement contained volumes, and Grace felt her heart quicken in response. The music drew to a close, but neither of them moved immediately to separate. The moment was broken by a commotion near the church entrance. A man staggered into the yard, his clothes disheveled and face flushed with drink or anger. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet gathering. "Where's this Boston lady who thinks she can run Blackburns?" Preston's posture stiffened, his hand tightening protectively around Grace's. "Frank Hollister," he muttered, "local troublemaker. Ezra refused him credit last year when his gambling debts got out of hand." The drunk man spotted Grace and lurched toward them. "There she is. Miss High and Mighty from back east." His words slurred together. "Think you can just waltz in and take over, don't you?" Several men moved to intercept him, but Preston was already stepping forward, positioning himself between Grace and the approaching threat. "That's enough, Frank," Preston said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable warning. "You're drunk. Go home before you do something you'll regret." Hollister's bleary eyes focused on Preston. "Of course you defend her, Gray, always trying to rise above your station, ain't you? First cozying up to Jenkins, now this fancy lady." A muscle ticked in Preston's jaw, but his voice remained steady. "Last warning, Frank, walk away now." The town marshal appeared, taking Hollister firmly by the arm. "Come on, Frank, night in the cell will do you good." As he led the protesting man away, the marshal nodded apologetically to Grace. "Sorry about that, Miss Blackburn. Frank's had a hard time since his wife left." As the disruption faded, conversations gradually resumed, though Grace noticed many curious glances directed their way. Preston turned to her, concern evident in his expression. "Are you all right?" Grace nodded, though her heart still raced. "Yes, thank you. Does that happen often?" "Frank's usually harmless when sober," Preston replied, "but he's been drinking more since Ezra refused him credit." He hesitated. "Perhaps I should see you home." Although the evening was still young, Grace found herself agreeing. The confrontation had left her unsettled, not for her safety, but because of the hints about Preston's position in the community. They walked back to the store in silence, the night air cool against Grace's flushed skin. At her door, Preston paused. "I apologize for the early end to the evening," he said stiffly. "It's not your fault," Grace assured him. "I'm grateful for your company and your protection." Preston's expression softened. Hollister was out of line with what he said. "About you?" Grace asked directly. A shadow crossed Preston's face. "Some folks have fixed ideas about who belongs where. Because you work as a cowhand. Because I started with nothing." Preston's voice held a touch of bitterness. "My pa lost everything in the Apache raids. I've worked my way up from stable boy to head wrangler through hard work, but some people still see the barefoot kid who mucked stalls for pennies." Grace studied him in the moonlight, seeing the pride and determination that had shaped him. On impulse, she reached out to touch his arm. "What others think matters far less than what you know to be true." Preston covered her hand with his own. "You're quite something, Grace Blackburn." The way he looked at her made her breath catch. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and realized with surprising clarity that she wanted him to. Instead, he stepped back, releasing her hand. "Good night, Grace. Thank you for accompanying me this evening." "Thank you for inviting me," she replied, oddly disappointed. "Good night, Prees." As she watched him walk away, Grace knew that something significant had shifted between them and within her. Preston Gray was unlike any man she had known in Boston, and her attraction to him went beyond his handsome features or the fact that he had saved her life. There was a depth to him, a quiet integrity that called to something within her own heart. Closing the door, Grace leaned against it, her mind swirling with new emotions and possibilities. Tucson was proving to be far more interesting and complicated than she had anticipated. The following weeks settled into a rhythm as Grace grew more comfortable with running the store and post office. Business was steady, and she found satisfaction in serving the community and putting her own stamp on the operation. She introduced a section dedicated to ladies' notions that proved popular, ordered more books based on customer requests, and began keeping the store open later on Saturdays to accommodate ranch hands who came to town only once a week. Preston became a regular visitor, stopping by when his duties at the double bar brought him to town. Sometimes he helped unload heavy deliveries or fix a broken shelf. Other times he simply sat on a barrel near the counter, whittling while Grace served customers. Their friendship deepened through these casual encounters, conversations flowing easily between practical matters and personal dreams. Grace learned that Preston had saved nearly enough to make a down payment on a small ranch of his own, though suitable land was scarce near Tucson. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Boston and her hope to expand the store's offerings to include more essentials for the territory's growing population. "You've taken to merchant life well," Preston observed one afternoon as he helped her inventory a shipment of tools. "Your uncle would be proud," Grace smiled, pleased by the compliment. "I find I enjoy it more than I expected. There's something satisfying about providing exactly what people need." "And you're good with people," Preston added. "Even old Schmidt smiles when he comes in now, and I've known that man to scowl at puppies." Grace laughed, the sound echoing in the quiet store. "Mr. Schmidt just needed someone to listen to his stories about the old country. Apparently my uncle was the only one who would." "And now you," Preston said, his expression warm as he regarded her across the counter. "You've made quite an impression on Tucson in a short time." Grace felt a blush rise to her cheeks under his admiring gaze. These moments of connection between them had grown more frequent, though Preston maintained a careful propriety in his behavior. He had escorted her to several more community gatherings, and they had shared meals both in her apartment above the store and at the local cafe. Yet he had made no formal declaration of his feelings, and Grace found herself increasingly frustrated by the undefined nature of their relationship. The bell above the door jangled, interrupting the moment. A tall, distinguished man in his 60s entered, his clothes marking him as wealthy by local standards. "Miss Blackburn," he inquired, removing his hat. "I'm Edward Jenkins, owner of the Double Bar Ranch." Grace straightened, recognizing the name of Preston's employer. "Mr. Jenkins, a pleasure to meet you." She glanced at Preston, who had risen to his feet, his expression carefully neutral. "I believe you know Mr. Gray." Jenkins nodded curtly in Preston's direction. "Gray, didn't expect to find you in town today." "Just helping Miss Blackburn with a delivery, sir," Preston replied, his tone respectful but guarded. "I was about to head back to the ranch." An awkward silence fell before Jenkins turned his attention back to Grace. "I've been meaning to introduce myself, Miss Blackburn. Your uncle was a valued business associate. I hope we can continue that relationship." "Of course," Grace replied, noting the tension between the two men. "The Double Bar's account is in excellent standing." Good, good." Jenkins glanced around the store approvingly. "You've made some changes, I see. For the better, I'd say." As the conversation continued, Preston quietly gathered his hat. "I should be going," he said. "Those horses won't break themselves." Grace wanted to ask him to stay but recognized the awkwardness of the situation. "Thank you for your help today, Mr. Gray," Preston nodded, touching his hat brim. "Miss Blackburn, Mr. Jenkins." With that, he departed, his shoulders set in a rigid line. Jenkins watched him go with a thoughtful expression. "Gray's a good worker, best horseman I've had in 20 years. "He speaks highly of the Double Bar," Grace replied cautiously. Jenkins turned his shrewd eyes on her. "Word is you two have been spending considerable time together." Grace lifted her chin. "Mr. Gray has been kind enough to introduce me to Tucson society." A knowing smile crossed the older man's face. "No need to be defensive, Miss Blackburn. Gray's a fine man, despite his humble beginnings." He selected a package of tobacco from the shelf. "In fact, I've been considering offering him a partnership in the ranch." Surprise must have shown on Grace's face, for Jenkins continued, "I'm not getting any younger, and my daughter has no interest in Arizona ranching. Gray knows the operation inside and out." "That's generous of you," Grace managed, processing this unexpected information. Jenkins shrugged. "Good business sense. Keep my best man invested in the ranch's future." He placed coins on the counter for his purchase. "Though I wonder if his ambitions might be shifting now that you're in town." Before Grace could formulate a response to this pointed observation, Jenkins tipped his hat. "Good day, Miss Blackburn. Give my regards to Gray when next you see him." After he left, Grace stood motionless behind the counter, her mind racing. If Jenkins offered Preston a partnership, it would be a significant step toward the security and recognition he deserved. But why had Preston never mentioned this possibility? And what had Jenkins meant about Preston's ambitions shifting? That evening, as Grace closed the store, she found herself watching the street for Preston's familiar figure, but he did not appear. A sense of unease settled over her as she prepared a solitary supper in her apartment. Her meal was interrupted by an urgent knocking at the store's front door. Hurrying downstairs, lamp in hand, she was startled to find one of the double bar's young ranch hands, his expression grave. "Miss Blackburn, sorry to disturb you, but there's been an accident at the ranch," he said breathlessly. "Pries sent me to fetch the doctor, but I thought you'd want to know." Grace's heart lurched. "Is he hurt?" "Not him, madam. It's Mr. Jenkins. Horse threw him into a ravine." "Pries got him out, but he's in a bad way. Doctor's heading there now." Relief that Preston was unharmed quickly gave way to concern for Jenkins. "Thank you for telling me. Please let Mr. Gray know I'm thinking of them both." The young man nodded and hurried off to complete his errand, leaving Grace with a growing sense of foreboding. If Jenkins died, what would become of the ranch and of Preston's future? 3 days passed with no word from the double bar. Grace attended to her business, but her thoughts continually strayed to Preston and the injured rancher. Finally, unable to bear the suspense any longer, she closed the store early and hired a buggy from the livery stable, determined to visit the ranch herself. The double bar lay 15 miles northwest of Tucson, nestled against foothills that provided water and shelter for the ranch's substantial herd. As Grace approached the main house, a sprawling adobe structure with a wide veranda, she saw activity around the corrals and bunkhouse that suggested normal operations, continued despite the owner's accident. A middle-aged woman emerged from the house as Grace reined in the buggy. "You must be Miss Blackburn," she called, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'm Martha Simmons, the housekeeper. Preston said you might come by." "How is Mr. Jenkins?" Grace asked as she descended from the buggy. Martha's face grew somber. "Holding his own, but it was a bad fall. Broken leg, broken ribs, and a head injury that's kept him unconscious more than awake." She gestured toward the house. "Preston's with him now. The doctor left this morning but plans to return tomorrow." Grace followed Martha into the cool interior of the ranch house, its substantial furnishings speaking of Jenkins' prosperity and taste. The housekeeper led her to a bedroom where Preston sat beside the bed of his employer, his expression drawn with fatigue. He looked up as Grace entered, surprise and something warmer flickering across his features. "Grace," he said softly, rising to his feet. Jenkins lay still and pale against the pillows, his breathing labored. One leg was splinted and bandages wrapped his head. "How is he?" Grace asked quietly. Preston ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "Unchanged since yesterday. Doctor says the next few days will tell." Martha moved to the bedside, checking Jenkins' bandages. "You need rest, Mr. Gray. You've barely slept since it happened." Preston shook his head. "I'm fine. But perhaps you could bring some coffee and something for Miss Blackburn." When the housekeeper had gone, Preston led Grace to a small sitting area adjacent to the bedroom. "You shouldn't have come all this way alone," he admonished, though his tone held more concern than criticism. "I was worried," Grace replied simply. "About Mr. Jenkins and about you." Preston's expression softened. "I'm sorry I didn't send word. Everything happened so fast, and then with Jenkins needing constant attention." He trailed off, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. Grace reached out to touch his arm. "What happened, Pries?" he sighed heavily. "We were checking fence lines in the north pasture. Jenkins' horse spooked at a rattlesnake and reared. He fell backward into a dry wash." Preston's voice grew tight. "By the time I got to him, he was unconscious, bleeding badly. It took me nearly an hour to get him back to the house." "You saved his life," Grace said gently. Preston's laugh held no humor. "If he lives, and if he does, he may never walk properly again. The doctor was clear about that." They sat in silence for a moment, Preston's expression distant as he processed the implications of Jenkins' condition. Finally, he seemed to shake himself from his thoughts. "I'm glad you're here," he admitted quietly. though I hate to involve you in this trouble." "That's what friends do," Grace replied. "Support each other through difficulties." Preston's gaze met hers, intense and searching. "Is that what we are, Grace, friends?" The question hung between them, fraught with unspoken emotion. Before Grace could formulate a response, Martha returned with coffee and sandwiches, effectively ending the moment of vulnerability. "You need to eat," the housekeeper declared, setting down the tray. "Both of you. Dr. Ward was very clear that you're to take care of yourself, Mr. Gray. Can't help Mr. Jenkins if you collapse." Preston accepted the food with a rueful smile. "Yes, madam." As they ate, Preston explained that Jenkins had regained consciousness briefly the previous evening, using that lucid moment to place Preston in charge of ranch operations until his recovery. "He has a lawyer coming from Tucson tomorrow to formalize matters," Preston explained, "just in case his condition worsens. He trusts you," Grace observed. "We've had our differences, but yes, he does." Preston set down his coffee cup. "Before the accident, he mentioned considering me for a partnership in the ranch." "He told me," Grace said, "when he visited the store." Surprise registered on Preston's face. "He did," Grace nodded. "He seemed to think highly of your abilities." A shadow crossed Preston's features. "A partnership would be everything I've worked for." He met her gaze directly. "But it complicates matters." "What matters?" Grace asked softly, her heart quickening. Preston leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Grace," a moan from the bedroom interrupted whatever he had been about to say. Preston was on his feet instantly, moving to Jenkins' bedside. The injured man's eyes were open, though unfocused. "Water," Jenkins rasped. As Preston helped him drink, Grace stood in the doorway, watching the gentle care with which the cowboy tended his employer. There was something deeply moving about seeing this strong, capable man show such tenderness. Jenkins' gaze eventually found her. "Miss Blackburn," he managed, his voice weak, "you're far from your store." "I came to see how you were faring, Mr. Jenkins," she replied, moving closer to the bed. A ghost of a smile crossed the rancher's pale face. "Dying men attract visitors. You're not dying," Preston said firmly. "Doctor says you're too ornery to die from a fall." Jenkins' hand gripped Preston's arm with surprising strength. "Papers," he said. "In my desk, lawyer tomorrow." His eyes drifted closed again, exhaustion claiming him. Preston carefully arranged the blankets before turning to Grace. "He's fighting, at least." "Yes," she agreed, though she could see the gravity of Jenkins' condition in Preston's worried expression. "What papers was he referring to?" Preston shook his head. "I don't know. Jenkins keeps his business matters private." He glanced out the window where the sun was beginning its descent. "It's getting late. You shouldn't travel back to town alone, not with dusk approaching." "I can manage," Grace began, but Preston cut her off. "No, it's not safe. Cougars have been spotted near the road, and there are always concerns about bandits." His expression brooked no argument. "Stay the night. Martha can prepare a room for you, and I'll escort you back to Tucson in the morning." Though Grace valued her independence, she recognized the wisdom in his concern. "Very well, but you must promise to rest as well." A tired smile tugged at Preston's lips. "Yes, madam." That night, after a simple dinner with Preston and Martha, Grace retired to a comfortable guest room. Through her window, she could see lights still burning in the main house, evidence that Preston continued his vigil. His dedication spoke volumes about his character, reinforcing what she had come to admire about him. As she drifted toward sleep, Grace acknowledged to herself what she had been reluctant to name. Her feelings for Preston Gray had grown far beyond friendship or gratitude. Somehow, in the span of a few short weeks, this quiet, honorable cowboy had claimed a place in her heart that no Boston gentleman had ever approached. The realization should have frightened her, a proper Boston lady falling for a frontier horseman, but instead, it brought a sense of rightness, of pieces falling into place. Whether Preston returned her feelings with equal depth remained uncertain, but she had seen enough in his eyes, felt enough in his careful attentions, to nurture hope. With that comforting thought, Grace fell asleep, unaware that fate was about to test both their newfound feelings and their individual dreams in ways neither could have anticipated. Morning brought clear skies and a slight improvement in Jenkins' condition. He awoke coherent enough to take broth, and speak briefly with Preston about ranch matters before drifting back to sleep. The doctor arrived shortly after breakfast, pronouncing himself cautiously optimistic about recovery while warning that the process would be lengthy. Complete bed rest for at least 6 weeks, Dr. Ward instructed as he repacked his medical bag. Then months of limited activity. He'll need constant care. Preston nodded grimly. I understand, and you, the doctor added, fixing Preston with a stern look, need sleep. You're no good to Jenkins or this ranch if you work yourself into collapse. I'll make sure he rests, Grace promised, earning a grateful look from Martha and a half-hearted scowl from Preston. The lawyer arrived mid-morning, a fastidious man named Hargrove, who closeted himself with Jenkins for nearly an hour before emerging with several documents requiring signatures. Preston was called in, and when he emerged, his expression was unreadable. Is everything all right? Grace asked as they prepared to return to town, the lawyer having offered them both a ride in his carriage. Jenkins has made me acting manager of the double bar, Preston explained quietly, with power of attorney for business decisions until he's recovered. That's wonderful, Grace said. He clearly trusts your judgment. Preston nodded, though his expression remained troubled. It's a responsibility I never sought, but I can't refuse him. As they traveled back to Tucson, Preston grew increasingly withdrawn, responding to Grace's attempts at conversation with distracted monosyllables. By the time they reached town, Grace was thoroughly confused by his change in demeanor. Will you come by the store later? She asked as the lawyer's carriage let her off at Blackburn's. Preston hesitated. I don't think so. There's much to arrange at the ranch, supplies to order. His eyes met hers briefly before shifting away. I may be scarce for a while. Before Grace could respond, he had tipped his hat and directed the lawyer to continue on. She stood on the boardwalk, watching the carriage disappear down the street, a sense of loss washing over her. Something had changed, but she couldn't fathom what or why. The following week proved the truth of Preston's warning. He did not visit the store, though she received a brief note informing her that Jenkins was stable but required constant attendance. Grace threw herself into her work, expanding the store's inventory and developing a system for delivering goods to outlying ranches, but her heart wasn't fully engaged. She missed Preston's quiet presence, their easy conversations, the way his rare smile transformed his serious face. 10 days after Jenkins' accident, Grace was closing the store when Thomas Wilson stopped by with news. Heard from one of the double bar hands that Jenkins has offered Gray a full partnership, Wilson reported excitedly. Papers signed yesterday. Gray's gone from hired hand to half-owner of the biggest ranch in the territory. Grace's hands stilled on the ledger she'd been closing. A partnership, already, Wilson nodded enthusiastically. Jenkins is no fool. Knows he needs Gray now more than ever, what with his recovery likely to take months. And this way, the ranch continues under steady management if Jenkins doesn't pull through. I see, Grace murmured, processing this development. While she was genuinely happy for Preston's advancement, his absence and silence since their return from the ranch took on new significance in light of this news. Town's buzzing with it, Wilson continued, oblivious to her distraction. Gray's come up in the world considerably. Some are saying he'll be the most eligible bachelor in Tucson now. The comment stung more than Grace cared to admit. Had Preston's elevated status changed his feelings toward her? Or perhaps success had simply revealed his true priorities, showing that his interest in her had been merely passing. Mr. Gray is certainly deserving of recognition for his hard work, Grace replied, keeping her tone neutral. Please excuse me, Mr. Wilson. I have accounts to settle before retiring. That night, alone in her apartment, Grace confronted the painful possibility that Preston's newfound position might have altered his perspective on their relationship. Perhaps, now that he had achieved the security and status he had worked toward, he no longer saw value in pursuing a connection with the owner of a general store. The thought brought both hurt and anger. If Preston's feelings were so easily swayed by circumstance, perhaps they had never been substantial to begin with. Grace had left Boston partly to escape social expectations that valued status over character. She had no desire to encounter similar superficiality in Tucson. Yet even as these thoughts circulated, a more generous interpretation suggested itself. Perhaps Preston was simply overwhelmed with new responsibilities. Or maybe he felt that his changed circumstances created an imbalance between them that required careful navigation. Either way, Grace determined that she would not sit idle, waiting for Preston to clarify his intentions. If he valued what had grown between them, he would make his feelings known. In the meantime, she had a business to run and a life to build in her new home. 3 more days passed without word from Preston. Grace maintained her routine, though customers commented on her subdued demeanor. On the 4th morning, as she was arranging a display of new fabrics, the store door opened to admit Martha Simmons, the Double Bar's housekeeper. "Miss Blackburn," Martha greeted her, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "I hope I'm not disturbing your business." "Not at all," Grace replied, surprised by the visit. "Is everything all right at the ranch, Mr. Jenkins?" "Mr. Jenkins continues to improve, thank the Lord," Martha assured her. "I'm here on a personal errand." She glanced around to ensure no other customers were within earshot. "It's about Mr. Gray." Grace's heart quickened. "Has something happened to him?" No, Martha said quickly. "He's in good health, just working himself to exhaustion." The older woman sighed heavily. "Miss Blackburn, I don't like to meddle, but I've known Preston since he was a boy mucking stables. He's a good man with a good heart, but sometimes his pride gets in his way." Grace waited, uncertain where this was leading. "He hasn't been to town since you visited the ranch," Martha continued. "And he watches the road from Tucson every day, though he thinks no one notices." "I don't understand," Grace said carefully. "If he wishes to see me, he knows where to find me." Martha's expression grew sympathetic. "That partnership with Jenkins has him all twisted up inside. It's everything he's worked for, but what?" Grace prompted when the housekeeper hesitated. "He thinks it changes things between you," Martha finally said, "that you might see him differently now that he's not just a hired hand." Grace stared at the woman, momentarily speechless with confusion. "Why would his success change my regard for him? If anything, I'm pleased that his hard work is being recognized." Martha smiled knowingly. "That's what I thought. But Preston's got it in his head that you might think he's getting above himself, or that people might say he's pursuing you now for your standing in town rather than genuine feeling." The absurdity of the situation struck Grace with sudden clarity. Preston was staying away not because his feelings had changed, but because he feared hers might have, or that others would misconstrue his intentions now that his circumstances had improved. "That's ridiculous," she declared. "Men often are, especially about matters of the heart," Martha agreed with a sigh. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but seeing him mope around the ranch is trying my patience. He cares for you, Miss Blackburn, more than I've seen him care for anyone." Grace's heart swelled at this confirmation, even as her frustration with Preston's behavior intensified. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Simmons. It seems Mr. Gray and I need to have a frank conversation." Martha's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." She glanced toward the door. "There's a wagon coming to town tomorrow with a cheese order. Preston usually sends one of the hands, but I might be able to arrange for him to make the delivery himself." Grace considered this, then shook her head. "No, I think this time I'll go to him." The next morning found Grace once again on the road to the Double Bar, her rented buggy moving at a determined pace through the Arizona landscape. She had left the store in Wilson's capable hands, explaining only that she had personal business to attend to. As she approached the ranch, she rehearsed what she would say to Preston, how she would make him understand that his pride and misplaced concern were standing in the way of what they both wanted. Yet all her carefully prepared speeches fled when she actually saw him. Preston stood near the corral, deep in conversation with a ranch hand, his posture that of a man comfortable with authority. He wore the same practical clothing as always, but something had changed, a subtle confidence in the set of his shoulders, the way others deferred to him. Success suited him, Grace thought, even as her nervousness increased. He looked up as her buggy approached, surprise and something like alarm crossing his features. Excusing himself from the ranch hand, he strode to meet her as she reined in the horses. "Grace," he said, helping her down from the buggy. "Is everything all right in town?" "The town is fine," she replied, studying his face. He looked tired, with new lines around his eyes and a tension in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "You, however, seem to have disappeared." A flush crept up Preston's neck. "I've been busy." Jenkins' condition, the ranch, too busy to send word, too busy for a brief visit, Grace interrupted, her carefully controlled frustration breaking through. "I thought we were friends at the very least." Preston's expression grew guarded. "We are, but things have changed." "Yes, they have," Grace agreed. "You've become a partner in the double bar, which I understand from Martha is everything you've worked for. What I don't understand is why that means you must avoid me." Preston's eyes widened at the mention of the housekeeper. "Martha came to see you," she did. "She seems to think you're moping around the ranch," I believe were her words. Grace softened her tone. "Please, why did you stay away?" He looked away, his gaze fixing on the distant mountains. "You know how people talk in small towns." "The moment Jenkins made me partner, the gossip started." "Gossip about what?" "About us. About my intentions." His jaw tightened. "Some are saying I set my sights on you when I was just a hired hand looking to improve my standing. Now they're saying I waited until I had the partnership to pursue you properly, like it was all some calculated plan." "And you care what they say?" Grace asked incredulously. Preston's eyes met hers, intense and troubled. "I care what you think. I didn't want you believing I only showed interest because of your position in town, or that my feelings changed with my circumstances." "Then you should have asked me what I thought instead of disappearing," Grace replied, her voice softening. "I've never cared about your position, please. I cared about you, the man who saved my life, who showed me kindness when I was new and alone, who sees me as more than just a Boston lady playing at business." Something shifted in Preston's expression, hope breaking through his careful reserve. "And now that I'm no longer just a cowhand." Grace stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Now you're still the same man I've come to care for deeply. Your circumstances may have changed, but my feelings haven't." Preston drew in a sharp breath, his hand reaching for hers. "Grace, Preston," a voice called from the main house. "Doctor's here for Mr. Jenkins." The moment fractured, reality intruding on their private world. Preston closed his eyes briefly, frustration evident in the set of his mouth. "I have to go," he said reluctantly. "Jenkins insisted on reviewing the cattle contracts today." Grace nodded, disappointed but understanding. "Of course, your responsibilities come first." Preston held her gaze, something resolute entering his expression. "Not always, not anymore." He glanced toward the house, then back to her. "Will you wait? This shouldn't take long, and we have much to discuss." "I'll wait," Grace promised. While Preston attended to Jenkins and the doctor, Grace walked the grounds of the double bar, admiring the well-maintained buildings and orderly corrals. It was a substantial operation, representing years of hard work and investment. That Jenkins had chosen to share ownership with Preston spoke volumes about both men's character. Martha found her near the kitchen garden and insisted she come inside for refreshments. As they sat at the large kitchen table, the housekeeper shared stories of Preston's early days at the ranch, his determination to learn every aspect of the business, the respect he'd gradually earned from even the most skeptical cowhands. "Jenkins recognized his worth long ago," Martha explained, pouring coffee. "Wanted to offer him the partnership last year, but Preston insisted on saving enough to buy in properly, not accept charity." "That sounds like him," Grace said with a smile. "His pride is rather formidable." "Stubborn as a mule," Martha agreed affectionately, "but loyal to the bone, the kind of man who'll stand by his word no matter what." Their conversation was interrupted by Preston's return. He looked tired but somehow lighter, as if a burden had been partially lifted. "Doctor says Jenkins is improving faster than expected," he reported, accepting the coffee Martha offered. "He's even talking about getting up for short periods next week." "That's wonderful news," Grace said sincerely. Preston nodded, his expression thoughtful. "He wants to speak with you before you leave." Surprised, Grace followed Preston to Jenkins' bedroom, where the rancher sat propped against pillows, looking pale but alert. "Miss Blackburn," Jenkins greeted her. Thank you for indulging an old man's request. You're hardly old, Mr. Jenkins, Grace replied, taking the chair Preston placed beside the bed. And I'm pleased to see you recovering. Jenkins' shrewd eyes studied her. Preston tells me you came all the way out here to set him straight. Grace felt a blush warm her cheeks. I came because I was concerned about a friend who seemed to have vanished. A knowing smile crossed Jenkins' weathered face. Friends, is it? Well, that's between you two. He shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. What Preston probably hasn't told you is that our partnership agreement includes living quarters. Grace glanced at Preston, who stood quietly by the door. I don't understand. The double bar has 2 houses, this one, and a smaller one about a quarter-mile east that I built for my son before he decided California suited him better. Jenkins gestured toward the window. It stood empty for years. Part of our agreement is that Preston takes ownership of it, along with the surrounding 5 acres. That's very generous, Grace said, still uncertain why Jenkins was sharing this information. The rancher's expression grew serious. Preston is the son I wished mine had been dedicated, honest, hardworking. This partnership isn't charity, it's recognition of his value to the double bar. He glanced at Preston. And now that he has a proper home and position, perhaps he'll stop finding excuses to avoid what's been obvious to everyone but him. Preston cleared his throat, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Mr. Jenkins, I don't think— Hush, boy, Jenkins interrupted. My brush with mortality has made me impatient with wasted time. He turned back to Grace. Miss Blackburn, I've known this stubborn man for 8 years. In all that time, I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Grace's heart quickened as Jenkins continued, the house needs a woman's touch, and Preston needs someone who sees his worth beyond his position or possessions. The older man's eyes held hers. Someone, I think, like you. An awkward silence fell as Grace absorbed the rancher's blunt assessment and implied blessing. Preston had moved to the window, his back rigid with embarrassment or tension, she couldn't tell which. Thank you for your candor, Mr. Jenkins, Grace finally replied. And for recognizing Preston's value to your ranch, as for the rest. She glanced at Preston's tense form. That's a conversation Mr. Gray and I need to have privately. Jenkins nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. Fair enough. Now, if you'll excuse me, the doctor insists I rest after visitors. As they left the bedroom, Preston's expression was unreadable. I apologize for that, he said stiffly. Jenkins has become more forthright since his accident. No apology needed, Grace assured him. He obviously thinks highly of you. Preston nodded distractedly, leading her out of the house and across the yard toward a path that wound through a grove of cottonwood trees. Neither spoke as they walked, the tension between them building with each step. The path opened into a clearing where a modest but well-built house stood, its windows reflecting the afternoon sun. A covered porch wrapped around 2 sides, and a small garden plot, currently untended, lay to one side. This is it, Preston said, breaking the silence. The house Jenkins mentioned. Grace studied the structure, trying to see it through Preston's eyes, not just a building, but a symbol of everything he had worked for. It's lovely. It needs work, Preston admitted. Been empty for years, but the bones are good. He hesitated before adding, would you like to see inside? The house's interior was simple but solidly constructed, a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with a proper stove, 2 bedrooms, and even a small study. Dust covered the few pieces of furniture that remained, and cobwebs draped the corners, but Grace could easily envision how it might look with care and attention. You could be comfortable here, she observed, running a finger along a windowsill. Preston stood in the center of the main room, watching her with an intensity that made her heart race. I could, he agreed quietly. Eventually, Grace turned to face him fully. Why did you bring me here, Pries? He took a deep breath as if gathering courage. Because Jenkins was right about one thing. I've been finding excuses, letting pride and fear get in the way of what I truly want. And what is that? Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Preston crossed the room to stand before her, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. You, he said simply. From the moment I saw your wagon heading for that cliff, something in me knew my life was about to change forever." Grace's breath caught as he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I told myself it was just admiration for your courage in coming out here alone, then friendship, then concern for your reputation if you were seen too often with a mere ranch hand." His hand rose to gently touch her cheek. "But the truth is simpler and more terrifying. I love you, Grace Blackburn. I love your determination, your kindness, your willingness to see beyond appearances. And I've been a fool to let pride and circumstance keep me from telling you so." Joy bloomed in Grace's chest, expanding until she thought her heart might burst with it. "Yes," she agreed, a smile breaking across her face. "You have been a fool." Preston's expression wavered between hope and uncertainty. "Grace," she reached up to cover his hand with her own. "I love you too, Preston Gray. Not for what you have or what you've become, but for who you are, the man who risked his life to save mine, who showed me kindness when I was alone, who sees me as I truly am." Relief and happiness transformed Preston's face as he drew her into his arms. "I never dared hope," he murmured against her hair. "Then you underestimated us both," Grace replied, lifting her face to his. Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more urgent. Grace's arms wound around Preston's neck as he pulled her closer, years of longing and weeks of growing feeling finding expression in this most intimate of connections. When they finally parted, both breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "This house," he said softly. "It needs more than repairs and furnishings to make it a home." "What does it need?" Grace asked, though she thought she knew the answer. Preston's eyes held hers, earnest and vulnerable. "It needs you, Grace, your laughter, your strength, your love." He took a step back, still holding her hands in his. "I know it's soon, and I have little to offer beyond this house and my share in the ranch, but yes," Grace interrupted, her heart too full to let him doubt for even a moment longer. Preston blinked, surprised by her directness. "Yes." "I haven't asked the question yet," Grace laughed, the sound echoing in the empty house like a promise of joy to come. "Then ask it properly, Mr. Gray, so I can accept." A slow smile spread across Preston's face as he lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands. "Grace Blackburn, I love you with everything I am. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Grace replied without hesitation. "Yes, with all my heart." Preston rose and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet in his exuberance. Their laughter mingled as he spun her around, the empty house witnessing the beginning of the life that would fill its rooms. "What about the store?" Preston asked as he set her down. "Your uncle's legacy," Grace had already considered this. "We'll keep it, of course, Mrs. Wilson has mentioned wanting more responsibility. She could manage day-to-day operations while I oversee the business. It's only 15 miles I could ride in several times a week." Preston nodded, his expression thoughtful. "And I'll need to be in town regularly for ranch business." "We could make it work. Together," Grace agreed, loving the way his eyes lit up at the word. "That's how we'll face everything from now on." Their return to the main house was delayed by several more kisses, each one cementing the bond between them. When they finally arrived, Martha took one look at their clasped hands and beaming faces and burst into approving tears. "About time," she declared, embracing them both. "Mr. Jenkins will be so pleased." The news spread quickly through the double bar and by the following day throughout Tucson. To Grace's relief, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Even those who had gossiped about Preston's intentions seemed won over by the obvious happiness the couple shared. They were married 6 weeks later in Tucson's small church, with Jenkins now walking with the aid of crutches giving the bride away. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which spilled from the church into the streets and continued well into the evening. As twilight settled over the festivities, Preston drew Grace away from the crowd, leading her to where their wagon waited to take them to their new home at the double bar. "Happy, Mrs. Gray?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. Grace leaned into his embrace, marveling at how completely her life had transformed since that terrifying moment when her runaway wagon had headed for the cliff's edge. "More than I ever imagined possible," she replied truthfully. Who would have thought that the most frightening day of my life would lead to this much joy? Preston's smile held all the love and promise of their future together. I knew the moment I jumped onto that wagon that I was exactly where I was meant to be. As they climbed into the wagon that would carry them to their new home, Grace reflected that sometimes life's most perilous moments could lead to its greatest blessings. Her journey to Arizona had been an act of courage and independence, but what she had found was something far more precious: a partner who valued that independence even as he offered his heart in return. The road ahead might hold challenges, but they would face them together, their love as vast and enduring as the Arizona sky above them. 5 years later, the house that had once stood empty now overflowed with life. Laughter echoed from the expanded porch, where Preston sat with their 3-year-old son on his knee, teaching him to whittle with a piece of soft pine. Inside, Grace cradled their infant daughter, rocking gently as she reviewed ledgers from the general store, which continued to thrive under her periodic supervision and Mrs. Wilson's daily management. The double bar had prospered as well. With Jenkins now largely retired, but still offering occasional advice, Preston had implemented progressive ranching methods that had increased both the herd size and profits. The small house had been expanded, with a new wing added to accommodate their growing family. Mama. Their son called, breaking free from Preston's gentle hold to race toward her. Papa made a horse. Grace set aside her ledger to admire the simple wooden figure. It's beautiful, Thomas, just like the ones Papa makes for the Christmas tree. Preston appeared in the doorway, his expression softening as he took in the sight of his wife and children. The years had added a few lines to his face and a touch of gray at his temples, but his eyes still held the same warmth when they looked at her, a warmth that made Grace feel as cherished as she had on their wedding day. Jenkins is coming for supper, he reminded her. Says he has news. Grace nodded, handing their daughter to him as she rose. I've already started the stew. Martha sent over fresh bread this morning. As Preston cradled little Elizabeth against his chest, his free arm wrapped around Grace's waist, drawing her close for a lingering kiss that still held the power to quicken her pulse. Have I told you today how much I love you? He murmured against her hair. Grace smiled up at him, her heart full. Yes, but I never tire of hearing it. Later that evening, as they sat around the dining table with Jenkins now fully recovered but content to leave ranch operations in Preston's capable hands, Grace looked at the faces of those she loved most in the world and marveled at how completely her life had been transformed by a single moment of danger, and a cowboy brave enough to leap onto a runaway wagon. Her wagon had rolled toward a cliff, and Preston had pulled the reins, not just saving her life, but steering them both toward a future brighter than either could have imagined. Every day since had been a testament to the love that had begun in that moment of peril, a love that continued to grow with each sunrise over the Arizona horizon.